She was lying in a ditch on the side of a forgotten road, bruised unconscious, and nearly invisible beneath the falling leaves. Her young son stood nearby, silent and shaking, waving at the one car that had slowed down when no one else would. The man behind the wheel had no idea that stopping that day would change everything, not just for them, but for himself. If stories of unexpected kindness, healing love, and second chances speak to your heart, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and stay with us as this unforgettable journey unfolds. Sometimes all it takes is one moment of compassion to rewrite a lifetime. Now, let me tell you what happened the day he stopped. Cassian Wolf wasn't supposed to be on that road. He usually took the highway home, less curves, fewer memories. But today, something about the golden light flickering through the cottonwoods along the back road had drawn him in. Maybe it was the crisp October air, or the way Rowan, his 6-year-old daughter, had pointed to the trees and said, "They look like they're whispering Daddy." Maybe it was just time for something to change. The road was narrow and mostly empty gravel crunching beneath the tires of his old Chevy pickup. Cassian drove slowly, one hand on the wheel, the other holding a paper cup of black coffee gone lukewarm. A folk song hummed faintly from the radio. Peaceful? Simple. Then everything shattered. A child, a boy, ran into the road. Cassian slammed the brakes. The truck skidded violently on the gravel, lurching sideways. Coffee spilled across his flannel shirt, but he barely noticed. Heart pounding, he yanked the gear into park and threw open the door. The boy didn't move. He just stood there, barefoot and wide-eyed. His face streaked with dirt and something red that might have been blood. He didn't cry, didn't speak, just pointed a small, trembling finger toward the tree line. Cassian's gaze followed. There, at the edge of the ditch, half hidden in the fallen leaves, lay a woman. He ran. His boots slid on the loose soil as he scrambled down the shallow slope knees, hitting the ground hard beside her. She was crumpled on her side like a discarded rag doll. Her blonde hair matted her clothes, torn and damp. A thin trail of blood curved from her temple to her jawline. Her lips were parted and her chest barely moved. "Ma'am," Cassian said, voice sharp. "Can you hear me?" No response. He checked her pulse. Weak, but there. He looked up at the boy, still silent, still pointing. That look. Cassian had seen it before. The numbness of someone who'd stopped hoping help would come. The kind of look his own eyes had carried the day he lost his son. "Okay," he breathed, forcing calm. "Okay, I've got you." He ran back to the truck and grabbed what he had: an old wool blanket, a roll of duct tape, a length of fishing line, a bottle of hand sanitizer, and a stained rag he used for wiping down tools. Not ideal, but he'd saved lives with less. He wrapped the blanket around the woman, careful not to move her neck. Using the duct tape and fishing line, he fashioned a makeshift brace to keep her arms still clearly dislocated. He poured the sanitizer on the rag and gently dabbed at her wounds, muttering apologies for the sting. When she moaned softly, he exhaled. "She's breathing," he said to the boy who had crept closer. "What's your name?" The boy blinked. "Auden." "Auden," Cassian repeated, memorizing it. "I'm Cassian. I'm going to take you both somewhere safe." Auden nodded, and for the first time the boy reached out and clutched Cassian's hand. The woman was light, too light, malnourished. As Cassian lifted her into his arms and climbed the ditch, he felt her shiver despite the blanket. He placed her gently in the back seat, adjusted the seatbelt to rest against her shoulder, then opened the passenger door for Auden, who climbed in silently and folded his arms protectively across his chest. Cassian drove. He didn't call 911, not because he didn't trust them, but because something in his gut said, "Wait." She looked like the kind of woman who'd already been failed by the system too many times. As the sun dipped behind the hills, his cabin came into view, a small, cedar-framed house tucked against the edge of the forest, with a porch swing that hadn't moved in months and a chimney that smoked only on Sundays. He parked the truck and hurried to open the front door, then came back and carried the woman inside. Rowan, already home with a neighbor who helped watch her. After school, ran to the door when she heard the truck. "Daddy," she called wide-eyed. "Who's that lady? Someone who needs our help?" "Sweetheart," Cassian said. "Can you bring me the big pillow from the couch?" Rowan nodded and ran off, her pigtails bouncing. He laid the woman on the sofa and propped her head up gently. Auden stood close, his hands clenched. "Is she going to die?" he whispered. "No," Cassian said with a steadiness he hadn't known he still had. "Not tonight." When night fell, the cabin was quiet. Rowan had gone to sleep, curled in Cassian's bed, and Auden had finally dozed off in the armchair, still wearing a coat too big for him. Cassian sat beside the woman, watching the rise and fall of her chest, wondering what kind of hell she'd crawled out of. Her face, though bruised, held a strange elegance. Her jawline was proud, her brows strong, her lips trembling even in sleep. There were stories there, painful ones, and something told him this was only the beginning. When Elowen Hart opened her eyes, the world was no longer spinning. It was quiet, too quiet. No sirens, no slamming doors, no sharp voices accusing her of lies. Just the soft creak of wood and the low hum of wind outside, brushing against window panes like fingertips against glass. She tried to sit up. Pain flared sharp across her ribs and left shoulder. Her head throbbed a deep, hollow ache, like an echo chamber. She winced and turned her face slightly. The scent in the air was wood smoke and something warm, bacon grease maybe, and cinnamon. The blanket wrapped around her was heavy like an embrace that meant to keep her here. She didn't trust it. Her eyes scanned the room. Not a hospital, not a shelter. A cabin. The walls were paneled with dark stained wood, the kind you didn't see in sterile places. Books lined the far wall, real books, not torn paperbacks. A fire crackled in the hearth. A coat rack held a flannel shirt that looked too big for most men she'd ever known. She wasn't alone. A man sat across the room in a rocking chair, tall, broad-shouldered, quiet as stone. He had a half mug of coffee in one hand, the other resting loosely on his thigh. His jeans were faded boots, dusty, and he hadn't shaved in a few days. His eyes met hers the moment she stirred. He didn't speak right away. Neither did she. After a long silence, he set the mug down and stood. He moved with purpose, but not force, like someone used to handling fragile things. "Good," he said in a low, reassuring voice. "You're awake." Elowen licked her cracked lips. "Where's your son?" he asked gently. She nodded, panic flickering behind her eyes. "He's fine," the man said, walking to the hallway. "Sleeping like a log." My daughter tucked him in. Elowen's breath caught. Otoshi pushed herself up too quickly, and pain punched through her side. She gasped, clutching at her ribs. "Careful," the man said, moving closer. "You've got at least 2 bruised ribs and a dislocated shoulder. I didn't have a splint, so I made do." "You..." "What?" He nodded toward her arm. "Fishing line, a shelf board, and duct tape. It's not pretty, but it held." Elowen looked down and blinked. Sure enough, her arm was secured neatly, if unconventionally. "I'm Cassian Wolf," he added, his voice calm. "You and your son were on the side of the road. He flagged me down. That's when the memory punched through. Auden. The road. The pain. The way she had prayed for once without asking for anything, only that her son might be spared." Her voice cracked. "How long have I been here? Just over a day." She looked at him sharply. "You should have taken me to a hospital." "I would have, but I figured if you wanted police or doctors, you'd have asked for them by now." Her heart pounded. He knew, or at least suspected. And I didn't want to risk them taking the boy, he added quietly. Allowance stared at him. No one had ever thought like that. Not in years. Not since her husband died, and the world flipped on its axis. No judge had looked at her and seen a mother worth saving. No officer had asked how the bruises got there. No neighbor had knocked on her door. But this stranger did. Her lip trembled before she pressed it into a thin line. Cassian stepped back and didn't push. Instead, he walked to the kitchen and poured a cup of water. You should drink something. He handed it to her. She took it with shaking fingers. As she drank, her eyes darted again around the room, always returning to the bookshelf. The titles ranged from Steinbeck to weathered National Geographics to a children's book with a ripped spine. Are we in the woods? She asked. Technically, yeah. Closest town's 15 miles down the ridge. This cabin's mine. Built it myself. Well, me and my late wife. Allowance froze. I'm sorry. Thanks, he said. Then added, It's been 5 years. She glanced at the fire. Feels like more than a day's gone by. Time's funny out here, he replied. Sometimes it slows down. Sometimes it helps you breathe again. She didn't answer that. She couldn't. Then from the hallway, small footsteps pattered. A little girl appeared, her hair a tangle of blonde curls dragging a faded stuffed fox. Daddy, she whispered. Is she the lady? Cassian nodded. Come say hello, Rowan. The girl crept closer. Hi, I'm 6. Are you the boy's mom? Allowance blinked, then gave the girl a faint smile. Yes. My name's Allowance. Your boy fixed my flashlight? All by himself, did he? Rowan nodded solemnly, then whispered, He's kinda like magic. Cassian chuckled low in his chest. You're not wrong. The girl tiptoed forward and placed the stuffed fox next to Elowen's pillow. You can borrow him until you feel better. His name's Kip. Then she was gone. Allowance stared at the fox, then at Cassian. Her voice dropped. Why are you doing this? He met her eyes and said without blinking, Because once someone stopped for me when they didn't have to. And because that boy of yours looked at me like maybe I could still be good. A knot formed in her throat. She looked away so he wouldn't see her tears. But he did, and for the first time in a long, long time, she didn't feel judged for it. Cassian watched from the porch as the morning sun spilled over the ridge like melted gold. It had rained softly before dawn, leaving the earth damp and fragrant. His hands were still dusty with flour from kneading the dough, his grandmother's recipe barely legible on an old index card Rowan had once tried to color in with crayons. Inside the cabin was quiet. He stepped back through the door and wiped his hands on a towel. The scent of yeast and cinnamon drifted through the air, mingling with pine and ash from the low fire. The woman Allowance was sitting up now. Not all the way, but enough to reach for the water on the nightstand, without wincing too hard. Progress. She looked less pale than yesterday. A bit of pink had returned to her cheeks and she'd combed her hair back with trembling fingers. There was a sort of bruised beauty in her restraint, the way she moved like someone still expecting pain to follow any moment of comfort. Morning, he said, voice soft, so as not to startle. She nodded. It smells like a bakery in here. I bake on Sundays, he replied, though it was Tuesday. Helps the place feel less hollow. She didn't ask what he meant by that. Instead, her eyes drifted to the open kitchen, where Rowan sat on a stool watching a bowl of rising dough, like it might perform magic at any moment. Cassian placed a small wooden tray in front of Allowance, a plate of warm scrambled eggs toast, with wild blueberry jam and sliced apples dusted with cinnamon. She looked at the tray, then at him. You didn't have to do all this. I know, he said simply. But I did. She hesitated before picking up the fork. Her movements were delicate, like someone trying not to break something invisible. After a few bites, she said, Auden tells me your daughter has a whole box of art supplies. She does, Cassian chuckled. She draws on everything she's not supposed to. Last week, I found a mural of a dragon inside my toolbox lid. Elowen smiled faintly. It suited her surprisingly soft, on a face that had learned too young how to brace for impact. You're good with kids, she said. He shrugged. Most days. Some days I'm just a guy trying to make it to bedtime without stepping on a Lego barefoot. She laughed, quiet but real. Auden came in, then holding a broken flashlight in one hand, and Rowan's stuffed fox under his arm. I fixed it, he announced, flicking on the beam to prove it. Cassian raised an eyebrow. How wires were loose. I used one from the radio. You're 7, right? Auden blinked. Almost 8. Cassian exchanged a look with Elowen, who gave a small shake of her head, almost apologetic. He's always been. Like that, she said. Takes things apart, puts them back together better than they were before. Cassian crouched beside Auden. Remind me not to let you near the truck engine. I could make it faster, Auden replied, dead serious. Cassian grinned. That's what I'm afraid of. Later that day, after Rowan had gone to school with the neighbor, and Auden had settled down with a pile of books from Cassian's shelf, Elowen asked for help getting to the porch. She wanted air, she said. And sun. He brought her a light shawl and helped her walk the few steps from the sofa to the rocking chair outside. Her grip on his forearm was tight. Her jaw clenched against the pain, but she didn't complain. Once seated, she leaned back and exhaled like someone surfacing from deep water. The forest spread out before them, rustling, and golden birds chattering overhead like old friends. You live here year-round? She asked. Yeah. Alone? Cassian tilted his head. With Rowan? But. Yeah. She was quiet a moment. Then I used to be afraid of silence. After my husband died, it was like the quiet screamed at me. I filled the house with noise, TV, music, anything, just so I wouldn't have to hear myself think. He nodded, not pressing. Funny, she said, voice softer now. I'm not afraid of it here. Cassian didn't reply. He didn't need to. Sometimes the deepest connection came from simply sharing the same silence. That evening, while he was chopping vegetables for stew, Elowen asked from the couch, "Do you ever get tired?" He looked up. Of what carrying all of this, she said, gesturing to the cabin, to Rowan, to the space between them. Holding things together. He paused, knife hovering over a carrot. Every day. She blinked, surprised at his honesty. But then Rowan laughs, he added. Or I see the firelight hit a page just right while I'm reading. Or a stranger wakes up on my couch and reminds me that I still know how to give a damn. Elowen stared at him. Something fragile flickered in her eyes. Admiration, maybe. Or awe. Or grief. Or all three. She looked down at her lap. My in-laws said I was unfit. That I was soft, dramatic, unstable. They threatened custody. Then one night, I didn't lock the bedroom door fast enough. Cassian's hand froze on the cutting board. Auden saw everything she whispered. I grabbed him, ran into the dark, and never looked back. He put the knife down, quietly, respectfully. You didn't just run, he said. You survived. She nodded slowly, tears tracking down her cheeks now. Barely. He stepped forward and handed her a clean dish towel. She took it like it was something sacred. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, Cassian sat on the porch alone. A storm was forming on the horizon. The air was heavy, humming. Inside, Elowen was resting, her breathing deeper, now untroubled. He looked up at the sky, then closed his eyes. He didn't know what was coming next. But for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of it. Cassian had lived in the woods long enough to know when something didn't belong. It wasn't the mother, this time. It was the boy. Auden wasn't just bright. He was different. Cassian had seen precocious kids before Rowan herself had taught herself to read road signs at 4, But this boy, he had gears in his fingers and equations in his eyes. And he wasn't trying to impress anyone. That's what caught Cassian most off guard. The old cuckoo clock had sat on his workshop shelf for years. His late wife Brielle had found it at a flea market in Vermont and insisted it was charming, even though it hadn't ticked since the Clinton administration. Cassian had meant to throw it out more than once, but couldn't bring himself to. That morning, when he walked into the garage to grab his tool bag, Auden was already there, balanced on a milk crate, hands elbow-deep in brass and rust. The kid hadn't asked permission. He'd simply opened the back, laid the parts out like a surgeon, and began working. Cassian stood at the door, arms crossed, watching. "Need a hand?" Auden barely looked up. "No, thank you." "You know what you're doing. I read a book on pendulum timing," he replied, as casually as if he were talking about baseball. "The problem's in the escapement wheel." Cassian blinked. "What's your last name, Auden?" The boy paused. His face didn't twitch, but his fingers slowed. "Hart." Cassian nodded slowly, noting the hesitation. "You hungry?" Auden looked up, then eyes blue and piercing. "Starving." Cassian smiled. "Let's fix that first." Over breakfast, Elowen sat with her hair damp from the morning wash wrapped loosely in a towel. Her bruises had yellowed at the edges, softening into something survivable. She looked stronger, though her movements still held the caution of someone waiting for the world to hit her again. Cassian poured her coffee. "Your son fixed my clock." Elowen raised an eyebrow. "Of course he did." "Do you homeschool him?" She paused. "We did for a while. My husband, he was brilliant, a design engineer with a mind like an engine. But when he died, everything shifted." "What about school?" After that, Elowen looked down. "I tried public school in the city. They said Auden was disruptive because he kept correcting the teacher. Said he lacked social cohesion." Cassian snorted. "That's a fancy way of saying he's smarter than they're comfortable with. He started building things out of scrap. I woke up once and found he'd rewired the hallway light with a motion sensor. I asked how he knew how to do it. He said he just listened." Cassian watched the boy now sitting cross-legged with Rowan on the rug. He was building a solar system out of nuts bolts and buttons they'd pulled from a jar. Each planet was scaled, orbiting on threads suspended from chopsticks. Rowan giggled as her moon swung into Saturn. "I've never met a kid like him," Cassian murmured. "You and me both," Elowen said softly. That afternoon, Rowan insisted on teaching Auden how to climb trees. They wandered into the backyard, a patch of soft dirt, and old oaks that had once been a swing set before time, and storms took their toll. Cassian followed at a distance, splitting wood with his axe, one eye always drifting back to the children. At first, Auden refused to climb. He said he didn't like heights. Rowan told him he didn't have to go high, just far enough to see the leaves move from the inside. That did it. By the time Cassian wiped the sweat from his brow, Auden was halfway up the first branch, arms stiff, but determined Rowan cheering below like she was announcing the Super Bowl. When he finally jumped down, laughing, Cassian saw Elowen standing on the porch, watching her son with a look that broke his heart a little. She had the gaze of someone seeing a child, finally allowed to be a child again. As evening fell, Elowen helped Cassian prepare dinner. She insisted on it, refused to lie on the couch like an invalid. He handed her carrots to chop and kept a close eye as she maneuvered one-handed with quiet skill. "I worked in a cafe once," she said, slicing with practiced grace. "Before everything. What happened after she was quiet? Then I married up." Cassian raised an eyebrow. "That always a bad thing. Depends how far up you go, and how far they let you fall when the ladder breaks." He didn't push. Instead, he reached across the counter, brushed a stray hair behind her ear, and said, "I don't care what your past was. Not unless it hurts your future." She froze. then turned back to the carrots without a word, but her hands trembled just slightly less. That night, while the kids fell asleep under a fort made of couch cushions and an old quilt, Cassian opened the old tin where he kept letters. He hadn't looked inside for years. There, among a few photos of Brielle and baby Caleb, was one unopened envelope. Marchand Industries Confidential. He remembered it arriving the day after Caleb died, a letter he could never bring himself to read. A job offer, maybe. A condolence. He stared at it now, heart pounding. Then a knock came at the door. Cassian opened it to find Iloan standing in the moonlight, wrapped in her shawl, eyes wide. I just remembered something she whispered. The name Marchand. My husband worked for them. And his father, Edward Marchand. He vanished after the funeral. No one ever saw him again. Cassian's fingers tightened around the envelope. He finally understood. The boy with the gears in his hands wasn't just gifted. He was born for something more. Cassian had smelled it before he saw it. Storms in the ridge country didn't announce themselves with thunder. They came on with a certain heaviness in the air, a tension that settled between your shoulder blades and crawled into your spine. The trees grew still. Even the birds fell silent, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. He stepped outside just before dusk, a hand on the porch post, watching the clouds roll in over the mountains. Charcoal gray and thick as regret. The scent of rain hit the back of his throat like metal and memory. Inside the cabin, Iloan was folding blankets, while Rowan and Auden put away books and toys. The children had grown almost inseparable, Rowan's spark, and Auden's strange quiet, balancing each other like stars and gravity. "You expecting something bad?" Iloan asked, noticing the way Cassian lingered near the door. "Lightning," he murmured. "And wind. Probably quick, but strong." "Should we head to town?" He shook his head. "We're safer here than on the roads." Iloan nodded, though she gripped the back of the chair just a little tighter. Cassian scanned the property, checking the toolshed locks, the generator placement, the angle of the gutters. Years of living alone in the woods had taught him preparation was survival. He moved like instinct, but his eyes kept drifting back to the window, where Eloan stood, wound tight like a wire. And for good reason. By the time the first drops hit, the wind had already bent the treetops. The rain came sideways, tapping hard against the windows in irregular rhythms, as if the sky was trying to shake something loose. Auden watched the glass like it was alive. Rowan huddled against her stuffed fox kip on the floor. Cassian moved quickly but calmly. He rolled towels against the doors, lit the emergency lanterns, pulled the firewood inside. Iloan, despite her bad shoulder, followed his lead without hesitation, handing him tools, checking on the kids, closing curtains. But when the power snapped off with a loud click and the cabin went black, she froze. Cassian turned to her just in time to see her brace herself against the wall, eyes squeezed shut. Her breath came in shallow bursts. "Iloan," he asked softly. She didn't answer. He moved closer, not touching her, just close enough for his voice to ground her. "You're safe. We've got light. I've got a generator if we need it. You're not alone in this storm." Her jaw trembled. "It's not the dark," she whispered. "What is it?" "Being trapped," she said. "When I was with them, if I made a mistake, they'd lock me in the pantry. No windows, no clocks. I never knew how long they'd leave me there." Cassian's chest tightened. "You're not in that house anymore," he said gently. "You're in mine. And in my house, no one gets locked in anywhere." She looked at him, eyes wide and wet. The candlelight flickered across her cheekbones, illuminating the bruises that hadn't yet faded. But there was strength behind the fear now, and Cassian knew she was still fighting. Still here. The storm howled louder. A loud crash echoed through the cabin. Something outside had come down hard. Cassian swore under his breath and grabbed his raincoat. "Stay with the kids. I'll check it." "No," Alawan said, standing straighter. "Let me." He stared at her, startled. "You've done everything she said. You shouldn't always be the one saving everyone. Just tell me what to look for." He saw the fire in her now, a woman reclaiming her right to stand upright. But before he could respond, Rowan screamed. Cassian spun around. Auden was gone. The door was open. Cassian was out the door before he knew it, heart slamming against his ribs. The wind tore at his coat. Rain blinded him, but through the chaos, he heard it, a small voice calling out. "Mom." I dropped it. He followed the voice down the slope toward the creek bed. The old swing Cassian had meant to burn last fall had come loose and lodged itself against a maple tree, and beneath it in the mud and branches was Auden, kneeling soaked, clutching something in his hand. Cassian waded through the muck and reached him. "Are you hurt?" Auden shook his head, teeth chattering. I dropped Rowan's fox. She was scared. I didn't want her to lose it. Cassian looked down. In the boy's mud-caked hand was Kip, the little stuffed animal soaking wet, but intact. A lump rose in Cassian's throat. He crouched and pulled Auden into his arms. "You're a good brother," he said. Voice rough. "I'm not her brother," Auden whispered. "You are," Cassian said, holding him tighter. "In every way that counts." Back at the cabin, Eloan met them at the door with a towel and shaking hands. When she saw what Auden held, she choked on a sob. Cassian helped her sit, then stripped off Auden's wet clothes, wrapping him in a blanket. He turned back toward the window. The storm was fading. The trees stood like soldiers in the fading light. The silence that followed was almost reverent. Later, after the children had fallen asleep on a shared cot beside the fireplace, Eloan sat next to Cassian in the rocking chair, her injured shoulder wrapped, but still aching. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For not locking the door. For being the man my son ran toward, not away from." Cassian didn't reply right away. He simply looked at the sleeping children, their hands still tangled together. "I lost a boy once," he said, finally. 5 years ago. He was 3. Leukemia. We tried everything. Nothing worked." Eloan's breath caught. "I left the world after that. Quit my job. Sold the house. Moved here with Rowan. Built this place with my hands so I could remember what it felt like to build anything at all." She looked at him differently then. Not with pity, but with knowing. Recognition. Shared survival. The storm outside was gone now, but inside something had begun. Not a romance. Not yet. But a warmth. A fire stoked slowly, carefully by 2 people who knew how to lose everything and still keep going. Cassian stood in the dim glow of the kitchen lantern, the storm now just a wet whisper behind the cabin walls. His boots left faint marks on the wood floor, trailing mud and memory. He leaned against the counter, staring at the envelope he'd pulled from the old tin box again. Marchand Industries Confidential. He hadn't meant to find it tonight, hadn't planned on opening any ghosts. But when Eloan whispered the name, Edward, Marchand, something ancient and unfinished had shifted inside him. He turned the envelope in his hand. The paper was thick, embossed. He could still remember the courier who delivered it, dressed in a suit, driving a car that didn't belong in the mountains. It had arrived the morning after Caleb's funeral, when everything still smelled like lilies and sterile grief. He hadn't opened it, not out of anger, but out of numbness. Because nothing, not even a billionaire's offer, could matter when your child wasn't breathing anymore. And now, Marchand was back, in a way he never expected. The next morning, Eloan found the letter lying open on the kitchen table. Cassian had already taken Rowan to school and gone to pick up propane from town. The cabin was still but not silent. Auden sat cross-legged on the rug, flipping through a dog-eared copy of the Time Machine. The fire crackled behind him, its rhythm familiar now. Alawan touched the edge of the envelope. She wasn't going to pry. She never had, not even when her husband had begun locking his office door or when the bank statement stopped coming. But something about the paper, its careful folds, its weight, made her pause. Then she read the name again. Edward Marchand. Her breath caught. She moved to the sink, steadying herself, her hands gripping the edge hard. Could it be coincidence? Or fate? Or the cruel habit of life to circle back just when you dared to breathe again? That afternoon, Cassian returned, his face flushed from the wind. He carried groceries in one arm and a new scarf for Rowan in the other, still wrapped in tissue. He paused when he saw Alawan in the kitchen, the envelope on the table between them, like a third presence. "You opened it?" he asked, not angry, just surprised. "I didn't read it," she said quietly. "I saw the name. That was enough." Cassian set down the bag slowly. "So it's real. The name Marchand means something to you." She nodded. "My husband, his name was Julian Marchand, son of Edward. He died in a car accident 3 years ago, or they said it was an accident. But nothing after that felt accidental." He waited. "They blamed me," she went on, "his family. Said I had seduced Julian for his money, that I was never good enough, that Auden wasn't even really his." She looked up at him. But he was. Every inch of him. Cassian sat down across from her. "They tried to buy me off after the funeral, offered me a settlement if I signed away custody. When I refused, they changed tactics. Legal pressure. Rumors. Surveillance." She swallowed hard. "One night I found a wiretap in my car. That same week someone smashed my front window. After that, I took Auden and ran." She didn't cry. Her voice didn't even crack. But her hands tucked in her lap were shaking. Cassian leaned forward. "You think Edward was behind all that? I don't know," she said. "Julian always said his father didn't trust anyone. Not even him. But after the funeral, Edward disappeared. Not just from my life, from everyone's. No press, no public appearances. It was like he vanished." Cassian exhaled slowly. "I got that letter the day after I buried my son," he said. "I never opened it. I thought, what could a billionaire possibly say that would mean anything to me?" She looked at him with something between pity and awe. "You lost a son, too." He nodded. "Caleb, cancer. He was 3. I still hear him in the quiet sometimes." She didn't speak for a long time. Then gently, "Maybe that's why Auden ran to your truck that day. Maybe he saw something in you the way I couldn't yet." That evening, while Auden and Rowan built a blanket fort in the corner and argued about whether Saturn should have 3 rings or 4, Alawan stepped out onto the porch. Cassian followed, coffee in hand. The wind had stilled. The trees dripped quietly in the sunset. "I've been thinking," she said. "Maybe it's time to stop running." Cassian raised an eyebrow. "I'm tired," she confessed, "of being hunted, of watching Auden check the locks twice before bed, of teaching him to disappear instead of to speak up." He sipped his coffee. "And what would you do instead?" She hesitated. "I want to go to the courthouse," she said finally. "I want to face it. All of it. The accusations. The lies. I want to tell the truth before someone else writes the story for me." Cassian was quiet. Then, "That takes guts. I don't know if I have them yet." "You do," he said. She looked over at him, something unreadable in her expression. "Cassian, if I go, and they find us, and take Auden," he cut her off gently. "They won't. How can you be sure he stared out at the trees? Because I've seen what it does to a child, to grow up thinking they're unworthy of love. And I'd burn down every courthouse in this state before I let that happen again. Alawan exhaled something between a sob and a laugh. "You always this dramatic?" she asked. "Only when it matters." That night, after the children had fallen asleep under a sky full of quiet stars, Alawan found Cassian alone at the kitchen table, the envelope back in his hands. This time, he opened it. Inside was a letter, written in careful slanted script. "Mr. Wolfe, my name is Edward Marchant. You don't know me, but I have followed your story. You don't owe me anything, but I feel I owe you something. There are times in life when we fail the people we love, when we let power and fear speak louder than decency. I failed my son. I failed my grandson. And I fear I may be failing you now. If you are reading this, know that I have watched you from a distance, not as a man of wealth, but as a man who once believed in redemption. You have not disappeared. You have not crumbled. You have survived. And in that, there is something I may need to ask of you." Cassian stopped reading. He looked up at Alawan, whose eyes had filled with tears she hadn't permitted to fall. He knew she whispered. Cassian nodded. "And he's coming." It was Rowan who first saw the car. She was coloring on the front porch, a pink crayon in one hand, and Kip the fox cradled in the other, when the low hum of tires on gravel made her pause. Cassian in the kitchen pouring coffee didn't notice until her voice piped through the open screen. "Daddy," she said, "there's a ghost car in the trees." He set down the mug and stepped outside. It wasn't a ghost car. It was a 1970s Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow Midnight Blue, polished to a quiet gleam. It didn't belong here. Not among the wild dogwoods and cracked fence posts and cabins with rusted hinges. It belonged in gated courtyards or behind velvet ropes at car shows. It rolled to a stop just off the tree line where the gravel met forest. Then silence. The back door opened slowly, and an old man stepped out. He moved with care, but not fragility. A cane supported his right side, though his spine was remarkably straight for someone his age. He wore a tailored dark overcoat over a crisp gray vest. His silver hair was combed neatly, and he paused before moving forward like a man accustomed to being watched and judged. Cassian's grip on the porch railing tightened. Alawan appeared behind him, her breath catching the moment her eyes locked on the man. "Edward," she whispered. Auden, who had been inside, peeked from the window. His face shifted from confusion to stillness, a sort of internal recognition that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with blood. Edward Marchant stopped 5 feet from the porch and took off his hat. "I didn't come with lawyers," he said, "and I didn't come with apologies I can't earn." Cassian stepped down off the porch, slowly, his body a shield without being aggressive. "You came a long way to say something," he said. Edward nodded. "Yes, and perhaps to listen." He looked at Alawan. "You're thinner," he said softly. "I expected that. But you're also unbroken. I wasn't sure I'd see that again." Alawan said nothing. Her arms were crossed, not to guard herself, but to hold something in. "You watched us," she said finally. "You knew what they were doing to me. I knew pieces," Edward admitted. "More than I should have allowed, less than I should have stopped." And Julian Edwards' face flinched barely but enough. "My son made choices I didn't approve of," he said. "But he loved you. I knew that too late." Alawan's throat tightened. He died alone. Your name was the last one on his lips. That silenced the porch. Cassian turned, slightly watching Edward closely. The older man finally broke the silence. "I know what they tried to do to you. I know what they said about Auden. But I need you to hear something, not from lawyers or press releases, but from me." He looked at the boy now standing behind the screen door. I knew who Auden was the moment I saw him smile. That was Julian's smile, and his mother's courage. Auden opened the screen and stepped outside. Rowan stayed behind, watching like a child reading a book whose pages might catch fire. Edward lowered himself slowly onto the porch, step-eye level with the boy. "I wasn't there when your father died," he said. "I wasn't there when your mother needed protection. And there isn't a single dollar I've ever earned that can change that." Auden looked at him steady. "Why now?" he asked. The boy's voice wasn't timid, wasn't bitter. It was curious, too calm for someone so young. Edward blinked. "Because watching from afar only buys you time. It never buys you forgiveness." Inside, Cassian poured another cup of coffee, then set it down for Edward, without a word. Elowen sat beside Auden, her hand on his back. Cassian leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "I got a letter from you once," he said. Edward looked up. "I didn't read it until 2 nights ago." "Then you read it at the right time," Edward replied. Cassian tilted his head. "You want something from us, don't you?" The old man didn't flinch. "Yes, but not in the way you think. I want to give Auden what's his name, his inheritance, his legacy. But I won't take him from this house to do it." Elowen's eyes narrowed. "What's the catch? No catch?" Edward said. "Just a request." He looked at Cassian again. "I've built a life with walls so high I forgot what was on the other side. And when Julian died, I was too proud to grieve publicly, too cowardly to stand beside the woman he chose." He looked back at Auden. "If this boy is to carry my name someday, I want the man who raised him, truly raised him, to stand beside him." The room fell silent. Rowan broke it. "Does that mean Cassian gets to be like a grandpa too?" They all looked at her. Edward smiled faintly. "Perhaps it does, little one." That night, the Rolls-Royce was still parked by the edge of the trees. Edward had insisted on sleeping in one of Cassian's guest rooms. No security, no driver, just him and a suitcase. Elowen stood on the porch with Cassian arms folded against the chill. "You believe him?" she asked. Cassian thought for a long time. "I believe regret can grow slowly, but it grows." She looked down. "Part of me wants to forgive him, and part of me wants to let him rot." Cassian smiled without mirth. "Sounds like you're human." She turned toward him. "You think Auden should go with him?" "No," he said. "But I think Auden should know him. And I think if he's going to inherit a kingdom, he should do it from a cabin where he learned how to use his hands." Elowen's eyes softened. "You always know the right thing to say." Cassian shrugged. "No, I just know what I would have wanted for my boy." She reached for his hand. Not romantic. Not yet. But something passed between them in that touch. Trust. And maybe the first roots of something more. The fire crackled low as Auden sat alone in the living room. Kip the fox curled under one arm, his small figure swallowed by Cassian's old leather armchair. His eyes were fixed on the flames, but his thoughts were far from their flicker. He hadn't said much since Edward arrived. Not when the man had apologized. Not when he offered gifts or legacy or name. Not even when Elowen had knelt beside him that evening and said softly, "Whatever you choose, I'm proud of you." That was the problem. He didn't know how to choose. He didn't know what made someone a father or a family or a home. But he knew what it felt like, and that mattered more. Outside, Cassian split firewood methodically, the dull thunk of the axe, the only rhythm breaking the silence of the morning fog. The trees stood tall and wet with mist, and each time the blade struck, steam rose like smoke from the log's split center. He liked the physicality of it, the honesty. You hit something, it broke clean. No lies, no politics, No bloodline complications. Just cause and effect. Inside the cabin, Edward Marchand sat at the table sipping strong black coffee with the posture of someone not used to waiting. But today, he was a man learning patience. He watched Auden from the corner of his eye, watched the way the boy moved carefully through the room, stopping to fix the uneven drawer of Cassian's workbench without being asked. Watched him study Cassian's map of the mountain trails, redrawing the lines where erosion had changed the river bend. It wasn't intelligence that struck Edward most. It was the boy's quiet certainty. The kind of certainty he had never seen in Julian. The kind that wasn't bred in boardrooms or polished over fine china dinners. Cassian came back inside, wiping sweat from his neck with a rag. His gaze swept the room and landed on Edward. "Looks like the boy's been watching you," Edward said mildly. Cassian tossed the rag onto the chair. "He's observant." Edward looked at Auden, who was now thumbing through a book on solar circuits. "And he's listening, even if he doesn't say much." Ilawan entered the room carrying 2 steaming mugs of chamomile tea. She handed one to Cassian, the other to Edward, her eyes unreadable. Edward accepted the tea with a small nod. "Thank you." She didn't reply. Rowan came tumbling down the hallway, then hair wild and cheeks pink from sleep. She ran straight to Cassian and hugged his leg. "You promised pancakes today," she mumbled into his jeans. "I did," he said, ruffling her hair. "Pancakes coming right up." Edward watched as Rowan danced off toward the kitchen. She's fearless. Cassian smiled faintly. She was born during a snowstorm, spent the first night of her life by a fireplace. She came into the world fighting. "I like her," Edward said simply. "You'd better," Ilawan murmured. "She runs this place." When breakfast was done and the dishes were drying on the rack, Auden finally spoke. He stood in the center of the room, back straight eyes level with Edward's. "If I take your name," he began, "does it mean I lose the one I already have?" Edward set down his mug. "No, it just means the world might call you by something different." Auden nodded. "If I live in your house," he said, "next does it mean I leave this one?" Edward paused. "It doesn't have to. You could have both." Auden glanced at Cassian and Ilawan. "What if I don't want both?" The room stilled. Cassian shifted in his chair but didn't interrupt. Edward leaned forward slowly. "Then I will respect whatever you choose." The boy was silent for a moment, the silence longer than most adults could bear. "Then I want to stay here, with Cassian, with Mom, with Rowan. I want to wake up in this cabin. I want to fix broken things, and climb trees, and build things that aren't just for selling." Edward nodded slowly. "All right." But Auden continued, "If I do ever carry the Marchand name, it will be because I earn it. Not because someone gave it to me like a crown." Cassian felt something shift in his chest. Not pride, not relief. Something deeper, something almost sacred. He looked at Ilawan, who had turned away, wiping at her eyes silently. Edward sat back. For the first time he looked small. Not defeated, not disappointed, just older, quieter. "Auden," he said gently. "If your father were alive, I think he'd say the same." The boy looked down at Kip, now held in both hands. "He died before I could remember him. But I think I still feel him. Sometimes. In my hands. In my questions." Edward reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't open it, just placed it on the table. "This was Julian's," he said. "His father gave it to him when he graduated MIT. He never wore it. He said it made him feel trapped." Auden picked up the box and opened it. Inside was a simple silver ring, unmarked, understated. Cassian leaned in slightly. "You don't have to take it." Auden looked at all of them. "I want to," he said. but not as a symbol, as a reminder that I came from somewhere, but I belong here. That night, Edward stayed silent by the fire, eyes distant. He left in the morning. No ceremony, no promises. Just a nod, a quiet thank you, and a single line to Cassian at the edge of the gravel drive. You saved more than a boy here. You saved a name. Cassian watched as the Rolls-Royce vanished down the tree-lined road. He turned back toward the cabin, where Auden was building a weather vane with scrap metal, and Rowan was drawing the solar system on the cabin wall in chalk. And inside, Alowan stood in the doorway, waiting. For him. The mornings were colder now. The sun took its time climbing over the ridge, casting long shadows that lingered between the pines. Frost kissed the grass just beyond the porch, glittering like spilled sugar, before melting away under the slow breath of autumn. Inside the cabin, the air was warm, but the silence between Cassian and Alowan had stretched thin. It wasn't tension. It was something far more dangerous. It was the awareness of something becoming. Alowan folded laundry on the worn cedar chest, her left arm finally out of the brace. She moved slower than before, but with more certainty. Her steps no longer whispered across the floor. Her presence no longer tried to shrink. Cassian watched her from the kitchen, one hand wrapped around a mug of black coffee, the other unconsciously smoothing the creases in a dish towel he wasn't drying. She looked up. Their eyes met, and neither looked away. That afternoon, Elowen told Rowan and Auden she needed to go into town, to the courthouse. Cassian drove. The truck was quiet, but not awkward. Alowen sat beside him, her hands resting in her lap, fingers laced tightly. The closer they got to town, the tighter they became. Cassian glanced sideways, but said nothing. The courthouse was a red brick building with white columns, too proud for its age, too small for its pride. Alowan took one look at it and nearly turned around. Cassian touched her hand. "You're not alone." She nodded, once swallowed hard, and walked up the steps. Inside, they filed the paperwork. She requested a formal hearing to contest the false accusations her in-laws had left hanging like a noose. The clerk behind the counter blinked, surprised by the name Julian Marchand's widow. The woman who had vanished. Alowan stood straighter. Cassian didn't say a word, but his presence beside her filled the room like armor. When it was over, they stepped out into the crisp afternoon, the courthouse doors closing behind them like the end of a long-held breath. They didn't speak until they were halfway down the ridge road. "I thought I'd fall apart in there," she said, quietly. "You didn't." "I almost did." "But you didn't," he repeated. Alowan looked out the window, watching the treetops blur past. "I think I was always waiting for someone to stand next to me when I did something hard." And now she turned to him. "You didn't just stand next to me, Cassian. You stood with me." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. His hand rested briefly on hers. Nothing urgent, nothing presumptuous, just solid, present. And she didn't pull away. That evening, Rowan and Auden built a telescope from PVC pipe and a cracked magnifying lens. Cassian read aloud from a dog-eared copy of A Wrinkle in Time, his voice low and deliberate, while the kids listened wide-eyed by the fire. Alowan sat beside him, curled into the corner of the couch. She didn't follow the words. She followed him, the cadence of his breath, the curve of his lips, as he softened the consonants for Rowan's sake, the way his voice deepened when the story called for awe. She realized for the first time in years she wasn't just surviving. She was watching a man love a room without saying it. After the kids were asleep, she stayed on the porch wrapped in a blanket. Cassian joined her, a cup of hot tea in one hand, and a silence that wasn't empty. "I almost left," she said after a long time. "When the first night here, when I woke up and realized where I was, who you were, that it was safe." He raised an eyebrow. Safe made you want to leave. Yes, she said, because I didn't know what to do with it anymore. He nodded slow. I understand that more than I wish I did. She looked over. Do you ever wish you'd left? Cassian was quiet. Then every day I stayed after Caleb died felt like a betrayal of how broken I was. But leaving would have been a betrayal of the part of me that still hoped. Elowen stared at him, moonlight softening the hard angles of his face. Cassian. He met her gaze. I don't know what this is between us, she said, voice trembling. But I feel it. And it scares me, because I didn't come here to fall in love. I came here to survive. He set the mug down. Then let's not name it, he said. Let's not try to call it love or timing or fate. Let's just agree that something stayed, even when everything else left. Her eyes welled. She leaned forward slowly, cautiously, and pressed her forehead to his. His hand came up rough and warm, cradling the back of her head. They didn't kiss. Not yet. But something passed between them more intimate than lips, the kind of closeness that doesn't demand anything except truth. That night, Elowen fell asleep on the couch, a book open on her chest, a blanket tucked around her by hands she never heard. Cassian sat in the armchair watching the fire. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring: court rulings, names, paperwork, lawyers. But he knew that in this moment his heart had stopped running, not because it had nowhere left to go, but because it had finally found someone worth standing still for. The ribbon was just a formality. Auden had insisted on using real scissors, not the red plastic ones he'd said seriously. This is important. Rowan held the ribbon taut with both hands, her tongue peeking out the side of her mouth in concentration, while Elowen stood behind them, trying not to cry. Cassian stood at the center of it all, slightly bewildered, but deeply proud, a hammer still in his back pocket, and sawdust on his boots. They were opening the school that morning. Their school. It didn't have a name yet. Cassian had suggested something practical: Ridge Hollow Learning Center. Rowan had wanted Rainbow Unicorn School for smart kids and scientists. Auden had quietly proposed the Wolfheart School for Wonder. The sign hadn't been painted yet, so for now it simply said, "Welcome." But the name wasn't the point. The point was what stood behind them: a reclaimed barn, with windows that caught the morning sun, a wood stove at the center for warmth, and shelves lined with books that had been donated by every neighbor within 30 miles. Desks built from old doors and mismatched chairs. Solar panels on the roof. Tools in the shed. A single globe near the fireplace, cracked and wobbling, but still turning. And a blackboard. Because every real school needed a blackboard. It had started with a letter. Not from Edward Martian, but from someone Edward had quietly reached out to, a retired superintendent who'd been disenchanted by the bureaucracy of formal education and was looking for a second act. When she visited the cabin and saw what Auden had built out of scrap wire and cardboard, she'd said, "Well, this is a better start than most million-dollar charter schools I've seen." She'd left with a handshake and returned with state forms, grant suggestions, and a list of 3 families in the area whose kids had dropped out during the pandemic and never returned. We could give them something Cassian had said to Elowen one night. "No," she replied. "You already did. We're just making it official." On the morning of the ribbon cutting, the neighbors came. The mailman brought lemonade. Mrs. Albright, the 80-year-old with the walker, baked 6 loaves of banana bread. Someone brought a fiddle. Someone else brought tears. Most just brought themselves, their presence, an unspoken testimony to what they had watched bloom quietly from the ashes of something that had once been broken. Auden stood up and gave a short speech. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't loud. But it hushed the small crowd to a breathless stillness. I used to think I didn't belong anywhere, he said. That being smart made me weird, and that having no dad made me half a person. But then I came here, and I learned something important. He looked at Cassian. That family isn't about blood. It's about who stays. Later that day, after everyone had gone, and the laughter had faded into the rustling trees, Cassian sat on the porch steps, a cold drink in one hand, his boots dusty from the last-minute repairs he'd insisted on finishing. Elewyn came out with a book tucked under her arm and a quiet smile playing on her lips. You know, she said, settling beside him when I first arrived here, I thought you were a little strange, he chuckled. That's generous. You didn't ask questions. You didn't try to fix me. You just made space. He looked out over the clearing where Rowan and Auden were now chasing each other with paper kites made from old grocery bags. I've learned, he said softly, that people don't always need answers. Sometimes they just need somewhere to be. She laid the book down beside her. Do you ever miss the world? She asked. Which one? The loud one, with city lights and deadlines and noise. He shook his head. I miss the people who used to live in it, with me, but not the world itself. She nodded, absorbing that. Then, without looking at him, I'm not afraid of quiet anymore. He turned to her, studying the side of her face, the faint smile, the way the light caught her cheekbone, the steady beat of peace in her breath. I think I was waiting for you, he said simply. Elewyn turned, eyes soft and certain. And I think I was waiting for a place like this. A man like you. The kiss that followed wasn't rushed. It wasn't dramatic or sweeping. It was steady like everything else between them. Like rain falling on parched earth. Like two rivers finally choosing the same path. That night, the school sat silent under the stars, windows glowing gold in the darkness. Inside a chalkboard still bore the remnants of Auden's lesson plan. What makes something worth building? Cassian had stared at those words before locking up. He didn't know the answer, but he knew what it felt like. It felt like this, like love born from trust, like children laughing on land that once held only grief, like a woman who finally stood still long enough to let her heart settle, and a man who opened the door when the world knocked on it, not with answers, but with arms wide enough to carry someone else's storm. The road hadn't changed much. Same winding bend through the cottonwoods, same gravel crackling under the tires, same open stretch of sky that looked impossibly wide in autumn. But everything else was different. Cassian slowed the truck to a gentle crawl. The morning sun filtered through the trees, painting gold onto the windshield. Elewyn sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his. Rowan and Auden were in the back seat, half asleep, heads resting against each other, like they'd been born siblings. They hadn't spoken yet. They didn't need to. This was a pilgrimage, a circle closing. Cassian stopped the truck at the edge of the ditch, the spot where it had all started. The leaves were thicker now, blanketing the ground, in layers of burnt orange and amber. But the contours were the same. The slope where Elewyn had once laid, broken and unconscious. The patch of flattened grass where Auden had stood, waving his arms in silent desperation. Cassian stepped out first, then Elewyn. They walked slowly, like they were approaching a sacred place, and in a way they were. Right there, Elewyn said softly, her voice catching. That's where I collapsed. Cassian nodded, and Auden was about 10 feet that way. I almost didn't see him in time. They stood in silence. The only sound was the breeze threading through the branches above. Auden joined them a moment later, holding Rowan's hand. She whispered something to him, then let go. Auden walked over and knelt on the ground. Not to mourn, to remember. He pulled a small wooden stake from his coat pocket and began gently driving it into the soil. Cassian and Elewyn watched in silence. When he was done, he stepped back, and Rowan helped him hang the sign. It was hand-carved, etched with care. Here someone stopped, and everything changed. They didn't linger. It wasn't a place for weeping anymore. It was a place for honor, for testimony, for quiet, sacred gratitude. Back in the truck, Elowen reached across the seat and took Cassian's hand. "I never told you," she said softly, "what I prayed that day before I passed out." He glanced over, letting her speak. "I didn't pray to be saved. I didn't even pray to live. I just said, let him be okay." Cassian squeezed her fingers. "He is." She smiled. "And so am I." Weeks later, the cabin was quieter than usual. The school had closed for winter break. Snow had come early, blanketing the ridge in white. Cassian had built a sled out of old fence rails, and the kids had spent the afternoon racing each other down the slope behind the tool shed. That night, they all sat by the fire, sipping cocoa. Rowan told ghost stories. Auden explained Newton's third law using marshmallows and a spoon. Elowen curled against Cassian's side, her head tucked beneath his chin. "You ever think about leaving again?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "I used to think the road took everything from me," she whispered. "But now I think it gave me everything." He kissed the top of her head. "You gave yourself everything," he said. "You're the one who stayed, who fought, who kept moving forward." She looked up at him, eyes shining. "I didn't keep moving," she said. "I fell. You're the one who stopped." And then she whispered the words that had lived between them for months, unspoken but undeniable. "I love you." Cassian didn't hesitate. "I love you too." They married quietly that spring. Nothing fancy, just family, just the clearing. Just enough chairs for those who had walked with them through the storm. Auden stood beside Cassian as best man. Rowan scattered wildflowers down the aisle. Elowen wore a simple cream-colored dress and a ribbon in her hair, the same color as the leaves that had once cushioned her fall. Cassian read his vows from a folded piece of paper. His voice cracked halfway through. Elowen didn't mind. She kissed his hands, and then his lips. And just like that, they had built something stronger than shelter. They had built home. That summer, the school expanded. New children arrived. Parents brought bread and stories and tears. The barn became a hub for more than just learning. It became a place of remembering, of gathering, of beginning again. Edward Marchand visited often, but never stayed long. He knew his place now. He sat on the porch with Cassian one evening, watching Auden teach Rowan how to balance a compass needle. "He'll be better than all of us," Edward said. Cassian nodded. "He already is." Edward smiled faintly. "You gave him something I never could." Cassian didn't respond. He didn't need to. They both knew what he meant. Years later, Auden would come back to that road. As a man. He'd kneel before the sign he once carved and run his fingers across the words. Here, someone stopped. And everything changed. And he'd whisper under his breath, just loud enough for the trees to hear, "Thank you, Dad. If this story touched something deep in you, we'd love to know." Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today? It's always a joy to see how far stories of love and kindness can travel. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories that remind us of the good still left in the world, feel free to subscribe. We'd be honored to share the next one with you. From our hearts to yours, thank you for spending your time with us. It truly means more than you know.